deep sea podcast, Pressurised, a short, punchy version of our main feed that gets right to the scientific point. If you like what you hear and you'd like to hear the full episode, you can find it in the same feed. And now, to get right to the point. So I am joined from...
You want me to tell you where we are?
Go on, why is this interesting?
This is interesting because I'll tell you a little story here of why this conversation is taking place. So about 2 or 3 years ago, I decided it would be a really good idea to come to Antarctica on the ship because we've obviously got a big program going on, a big scientific thing going on, and we're doing fracture zones and trenches and missile planes and all the rest of it. So we had Antarctica on here. And so for the last 2 years, we had it all planned out. We're going to go to the South Orkney Trench, and we're going to do some great work in a nice cold sub-zero trench in Antarctica. And as per procedures and protocols, we went into quarantine in Chile for 5 or 6 days before joining the ship. And this is where I met Shaylyn Potter, who is from an expedition company who's come down to help us make sure we don't break the law in Antarctica. But I'll introduce Shaylyn later. But on the first day, she came to me and said, you know, that whole area is under ice right now. So 2 years, 3 years in the planning, the Weddell Sea has been breaking up and it's the worst sea ice for 15 years. So in the space of a couple of days, we rewrote the entire expedition to come over to the South Shetland Trench, which is where we are now. And I just did a couple of dives in the sub, and we've done about 24 landers, mapped a whole bunch of stuff, and it's cold.
Nice.
Yeah, I think the first day we met, we were just having coffee kind of casually and chit-chatting about what, your plans might look like for the expedition. And I said something like, well, what are you going to do? Or what's your backup plan if the ice doesn't clear? And people said, well, what do you mean?
The ice is supposed to be clear.
It's the summer.
And I thought, what do you mean? What do I mean? Yeah. And then we got everybody involved looking at the ice charts and thought, well, we can't go there. And so then a new plan evolved.
Yeah, but here we are. We're in Antarctica, and we've been here for, 2 weeks now. Got another week or so to go. And then, actually, I'm getting off, but Shaylyn's got another month to go yet. And then you're coming down here, Tom, eh?
Yes. Yeah. So any advice on what to pack? And I'm not sure. I think we're going to have the same problem. Everyone is continuing with the plan, but I think we're going to have to go somewhere else because it sounds like the Bellenhausen Sea is full of ice.
Yeah. Kind of constant reorganizing of things down in this part of the world.
Anyway, Shaylyn should introduce herself here because obviously we haven't had her on the show before.
I'm Shaylyn, and I first started coming down to Antarctica in 2015, and I was originally working as a scuba diver. But of course, with scuba, we're only allowed to go to 40 meters recreationally. And in Antarctica, you have this really weird kind of phenomena with the ice, the big icebergs around, and it's scouring all of the shallow areas. So basically, within your scuba depths, you're in this ice scour zone, and it's kind of boring to dive in, but I could be looking down the walls and see that there's a lot of life deeper than that. And so I got really invested and interested in what might be deeper than scuba depths. And I started getting into using ROVs on expedition ships, and then eventually trained to be a manned submersible pilot. So the past couple of years, I've been working as a sub-pilot on an expedition ship, and kind of my primary place of interest and work is in Antarctica.
Nice.
So you don't do the Arctic then? You're not a polar person, you're specifically Antarctica?
Well, I do the Arctic, but I don't find it as interesting as Antarctica. So I try to focus my time down here. Just more to see. I think it's more interesting.
Does that make you a polar snob?
I'm definitely a polar snob and a little bit, of a marine life snob as well.
It'd be really interesting to go into, having experienced both in quite a lot of detail, what are the differences? Why do you love the South over the North?
Antarctica is just so unique. If you think about where it is geographically, Antarctica separated from South America about 30 million years ago. So it's been isolated both geographically and then later thermally and then physically with the Antarctic circumpolar current for many, many years. And because of that, it's allowed for species to evolve and display high endemism here in Antarctica. So you'll see species here that you won't see anywhere else in the world.
That's true. The North Pole feels more connected. There's more currents going around there. It feels easier to access.
Yeah, it'll be easier for species to transfer to the Arctic from other regions, but to get to Antarctica, would just be so challenging. So like species dispersal just doesn't really happen so much between the other oceans and the Southern Ocean.
Very cool. And then Antarctica in particular, particularly with us in the deep sea end of things, like it's a species generator.
Yes.
There's so many things that went there really radiated because they're cold adapted. There's for some reason also deep adapted. And then they travel out along the trenches, the snailfish, the zooacids, the eelpouts, they all seem to have like generated lots of variation in this place, and then that let them then radiate out from there. So that's what I'm most interested in from going down there, is like seeing maybe the seat of some of these lineages we're so familiar with. This is sort of the powerhouse that churned out a lot of deep sea species.
I don't know that's absolutely dreams and aspirations, Tom, but I reckon you're wrong.
Oh, really? Okay.
We've been doing a lander survey from 1,000 meters to 5,200 meters, and we've done 24 now or something like that. So there's about 50 cameras worth of data. And after 2,300 meters, there's almost nothing but Coryphaenoides armatus. Literally nothing. Tonight, about 2 hours ago, was the first time we saw a single eelpout. We'd expected to be this like amazing, like super diverse fish fauna. Below, or at least sort of less than 2,300 meters, there are icefish. It's always solitary, not very friendly, and then the big Imacruras. And I swear that's about it.
There are over 200 snailfish hiding there somewhere under some rocks.
I saw one on the sub yesterday. I saw one snaily that I didn't recognise on the sub, and that was at 2,700. And somewhere else deeper, we saw a snailfish, but right on the horizon on one of the landers. So technically we've seen two, but two things are interesting. One is there's hardly any fish here for some reason. I don't really know why. But the interesting thing is the Coryphaenoides numbers are absolutely astronomical through the roof of 4,000 meters.
That's interesting.
I've never seen so many fish in my life. And they're all ridiculously infested with parasites. They've got pox, they've got parasitic copepods, they've got leeches hanging off their underbellies, they've got that fungal infection that's prizing their eyes at their heads. They're the ugliest bunch of lepers I think I've ever seen in my life.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's a story in there going on somewhere. But on the flip side, when we do a dive, we've done 1 to 5,000 and 1 to 2,500. And they are the most diverse and abundant deep sea fauna I've ever seen by a long way. There was just every single thing you can imagine there, just not really fish.
Yeah.
Does that ruin all your hopes and dreams?
When you think about Antarctica in general, I think it would ruin people's dreams maybe if they're like fish people. But for invertebrate lovers, then Antarctica is a really good place.
Yeah, great jellyfish too, some squid. And I mean, the 5,200 meter side, remember, like most of the times we dive to 5,000 meters, what you see is interesting, but you don't see that much. And you see some really quirky little things. And during a dive, you probably take a few hundred photographs, and it's good, solid data. Here, I took nearly 2,000 photographs just on the internal camera. And I still don't think we'd even quantified all of it. It was just thousands of brittle stars, sea stars, urchins, anemones, every possible shape and size. It was absolutely incredible. Honestly, it was so cool. And you think it's at 5,200 meters.
You've been sharing some pics on the Discord. They look really nice.
Yeah, that's nothing. That's just the first. That's all I can squeeze through the sky pipes. When I get a chance, I'll do some more. But yeah, super cool.
What's been really interesting for me, because most of my work, so all of the studies that I do, because now I'm about to start my PhD studying continental shelf seafloor biodiversity. And so I'm quite familiar with the literature of that region. And the submersibles I pilot, we can go to 300 meters. So it's just kind of getting barely into that deep sea realm, but we're on that continental shelf of the peninsula. And we do see a really high abundance and also quite a lot of diversity of pycnogonids. And as Tom mentioned, we think they originated and diversified from this region. And we also see quite a lot of octopus. And just the biomass and diversity at those depths is extremely high, particularly for invertebrate animals. So it's been really interesting for me to see deeper from the landers that we're just not seeing either that biomass or diversity. And I've been really, really surprised. We saw one pycnogonid and 0 octopus on the landers. So for me, that's been super fascinating to see that stark difference.
Yesterday, we saw one sea spider at the end, which is the pycnogonids, and a little octopus. I'll share the photograph for the podcast, but we came across a tiny little octopus, and we called it Curly because it was a little white curly thing with big eyes.
Adorable.
There you go. Quite a lot of squid, though, eh? There was a lot of squids up in the 1,000 to 2,000 meter range, and lots of red jellies, the Tracheomedusa, just the ones that just hover past. We've got loads of cool footage of those. Those are really abundant. So anyway, Shaylyn, you told me you did a dive in the caldera at Deception Island.
Deception Island is one of my favorite dive sites, both scuba and, deeper submersible depths in the peninsula. And I think it's just so unique compared to other regions. Like, I can see a photo, I can recognize that it's at Deception Island. I don't really know why. It's just, I can just recognize the assemblages of species. And there's not a lot of, information or literature on it about why it's so unique there. But I imagine the input of the hot water and maybe sulfur or whatever's coming out of that active caldera is kind of shaping that ecosystem. But it's quite different than any other dive. I dive quite a lot around the South Shetland Islands, and it doesn't look anything like what it looks like around Deception.
I think for those listening might not know what Deception Island is. It's part of the Shetland Isles, which is west of the peninsula, but there's a caldera, and it's basically has a 10-kilometer diameter or something, and there's a section which is broke off, so it's filled with water, so you can sail a ship into it. And there's an old British whaling base on the right-hand side as you come in. There's a Spanish research station there. I think there's an Argentinian one there. And I remember I went there about 9 years ago and just thought it was absolutely phenomenal. It was full of chin-strap penguins and all this kind of stuff. And it's just very, very unique in terms of the visual imagery of it. It's nothing quite like it. And when we were talking about this trip, I said to Captain Jim, it's like, if we do have to run from bad weather, what's our plan? And he's like, oh, there's all these bays and stuff up in King George Island or Livingston or whatever. And I'm like, all right, but if we get a chance, we should go to Deception Island. It's the coolest place. And right enough, a bit of bad weather came along and we were charging in there. It was brilliant.
Natural port.
Yeah, there's nothing really, as Shaylyn says, even above the water, there's nothing quite like it. It's just cool. Really cool.
Is there a difference in the slope elevation in this part of the world? Is it something about the sea ice pushes it down, or it's higher? Like our usual deep sea markers, when we do them sort of based on the shore, when we do like slope depth and things like that, is it right that it's slightly different here? And so our usual deep sea boundaries don't fit very well in Antarctica?
Yes. The 200-meter continental shelf is something that is unique to Western Europe. That's why the 200-meter mark was more or less decided that this is the start of the deep sea. But the continental shelf running right around Antarctica is actually 500 meters on average, not 200. And most places in the world don't have a continental shelf at all. So the 200-meter mark is a load of nonsense, I think.
It's imperialism.
Yes. Basically. But there are these big scars. The thing that's unique about it is what Shaylyn was touching on, these big chunks of ice that decide to leave Antarctica for good. One of the first things they do is they gouge big scars across the continental shelf and they tear up the seafloor before they ultimately calf off and break off the other and become icebergs to start floating north, which is quite unique to hear.
Does that change the habitat types you see? Because most of the inverts you've mentioned are sort of mobile, shorter-lived things. I'm guessing lots of scouring means there isn't big coral reefs and things that take a lot longer to establish.
Yeah, so the icebergs will definitely scour areas in the shallows. I mean, even down 200 meters, you can have iceberg scour. And so often if you're looking for places where you're trying to find diversity, you need to find protected areas or more vertical walls that are going to be protected from ice scour. And yeah, there are definitely, places with more sea ice cover as the sea ice is going to retreat, or we're losing kind of glacial coverage. You're exposing new areas of the seafloor and opening up new areas where things can colonize. But also as the ice is breaking off, you're going to deal with more iceberg scour. So it definitely changes the assemblages of species you can find, and the early colonizers are going to have to come into those areas first. And
you end up with things specialized to quite a high generation time, because I'm guessing that if it's scoured one place once, the chances are it's going to follow that same path the next piece that breaks off, or they tend to be quite random.
I think it depends on the area, but one of the most interesting things for me working as a sub-pilot is just seeing things that I guess I wouldn't expect to see on the seafloor. So there's this one area, and it's close to the Le Maire Channel, so all the cruise ships go there. It's this beautiful scenery, but there's this place where the shelf comes up to this quite little shallow shelf, and it's called Iceberg Alley because huge icebergs come in through the steep channel and basically just get stranded there. So we can like to go on little boats and look at the icebergs. And we were going to do a sub dive there. I thought, I don't really want to get in the water because I know the bottom's just scoured because there's massive icebergs stuck on the bottom here and they come through here all the time. But we went on a dive anyway, and I was really, really surprised to see some giant sponges. So some of the volcano sponges and different glass sponges were all over the bottom.
Not quick growing things.
Not quick growing things. Or presumably not always quick growing things. So I was really interested to see that, not just, when we're looking at areas that are scoured with ice a lot, you expect to see mobile species like the brittle stars, maybe some fish, or early colonizers like the tunicates and things that can come in and grow rapidly. But you don't expect to see, long-lived glass sponges. And so for me, that was interesting in thinking either these are just lucky sponges that have been here potentially for hundreds or thousands of years to avoid ice, or they're growing faster than we think. Yeah, so it was just really interesting.
Oh, nice. Yeah, when something turns up that's wrong or against your expectations, it's usually a good sign. Embarrassing, but usually a good sign.
Yeah, but I think we just know so little about this ecosystem. There's been a lot of data collected on parts of the continental shelf, especially around the peninsula or around stations. But a lot of the data we have is just presence or absence data. We don't know how it reacts over time. We don't know much about the biology of the animals. And the large volcano sponges, some studies show that they showed no growth within 10 years, and we think they can live up to 10 to 15,000 years. So for a long time, scientists thought, well, these are really slow-growing, long-lived species. But then when the Larsen ice shelf collapsed, within just a few years, we saw those sponges move in and grow really rapidly. Then we realized, well, given the right conditions and the food resource, then they were able to colonize quickly and rapidly grow. So can't really make assumptions or infer a lot about this ecosystem from, single studies. So it's been really challenging, I think, for science to make progress down here.
Yeah, things are still true, but they might not be true everywhere, even with the same species.
Exactly.
What else have we been up to? We've seen fin whales, penguins, birds. I was explaining to Todd and Shaylyn recently, who are quite prolific birders, that the little piece of my brain that remembers the names of birds, it seems to be somewhat corrupted, I would say is the right word. And all I see are small to medium to large seagulls. And not much else. I can't remember the names, but we've seen a lot of seagulls.
I think birds and knots with me.
We have seen some gulls, kelp gulls, but mainly we're been seeing the Cape petrels. Those are the ones around the ship. But you should see a lot of birds on your trip. So you'll see a lot of the albatross crossing the Drake on your way down.
I got to hang out with quite a few albatross last weekend when I was testing the gear down in the Kaikoura Canyon. There's I think we saw 3 species, but again, I'm like you, Alan. I'm just like, oh, that fella's got a slightly grayer head, and then it's a whole different one. But they're big.
I'm just like, Tom, look, there's a seagull the size of a dog. That means it's an albatross of some variety.
I mean, you might not be wrong with that. But that's probably a good separator.
This will be a good time to introduce people to, I'll get Shaylyn into this. Ice is not just ice. There's lots of different ways in which it can be characterized. Isn't that right?
Yeah, but as a scientist, I consider myself a lumper, not a splitter.
In ice taxonomy?
Yeah, in ice taxonomy. So I think the splits are a little pedantic, but I think it has, I might be wrong, but something like this. In order for it to be an iceberg officially, it has to be taller than 5 meters.
Oh.
And if it's...
That's not very big.
Well, it's pretty big. But if it's 1 to 5 meters, then it's a bergy bit. And if it's less than 1 meter, then it's a growler.
Wow. 2 new words.
Yeah.
And this is above sea level, isn't it? So they're considerably bigger below.
Yes. Yeah. So they're floating. So most of the icebergs, depending on its density, will be like 70% or so below.
I learned that from motivational posters. I don't know if it's true.
There was a big piece of ice we came across quite early on, a couple of weeks ago, and it was 13 miles long, something like that. It was great.
And do they stay berg no matter how big they get, or is there an extra size class?
I don't know if there's bigger, but the ones we saw, and you might see some as well with the flat tops, those are tabular icebergs. So those came from ice shelf, and that's why they look like that.
Ah. Do we sort of differentiate their origin, whether it's sort of glacial or sea ice?
Well, yeah, so it's definitely glacial ice, but you can have a glacier, like a glacial face or a tidewater glacier that will calve off icebergs, and they're quite large, but they're not tabular bergs. I'm not a geologist. You would have to ask somebody else. Devin on board has been able to talk to people about it. I'm just a naturalist and an ice enthusiast.
I'm not sure we should let the rock people have water when it gets hard. I still think it's in our jurisdiction.
Yes.
Just because it's hard like a rock, you can't claim it.
All right. But it's quite unique to Antarctica. So we have the ice sheet in Antarctica, right? So it's snow's falling on the ice field and it's flowing downstream to all these glacial outlets. If it's coming down to the water, touching the seawater and calving into it, that's a tidewater glacier. But in some areas where it's not so steep, the glacier itself, instead of crumbling off, can just keep floating out over the sea. And so it's not actually on the sea floor, it's floating, and that's the ice shelf. And a lot of them have been around for many, many years, thousands of years. And that's one of the concerning things that they're talking about with Antarctica and climate change is the ice shelf collapse, because these ice shelves are acting as buttresses for the ice sheet behind it. Because, over time, or for a long time, they've been relatively stable. So some of it'll break off. And these are the massive icebergs you see on the news that are getting stuck and disrupting things. And they give them names. They're so big. So right now, I think the popular one is A23A. And you can monitor it with satellites and see where it is. And these things are like as big as U.S. states. They're absolutely massive. And so when you're looking at it from a ship, it just looks like a wall of ice. You can't see around it.
Like land.
Yeah, it looks like land. So those are from the ice shelf. And it's concerning that those are breaking up. And we've already lost part of the Larsen ice shelf. And yeah, we're concerned about losing more.
You having so much experience down there, what feels different? What sort of firsthand things have you noticed changing?
People ask that a lot. I'm not sure I really noticed anything. I mean, we noticed some small changes, but it's hard to really quantify it. Like this is a really big ice year. We're seeing the ice change. So in some areas of the continent, we're seeing more sea ice and in some areas less. One thing we noticed just year by year, depending on the sea ice year, if it was a good ice year or a bad ice year, you see the dynamics between krill and salps change. And that's a bit of concern because when you're losing sea ice, the krill need to feed under that sea ice. So when it's a bad ice year, salps tend to out-compete the krill. And that's bad for the entire ecosystem because all of the marine mammals depend on the krill for food.
Far tastier than a salp.
Well, this is the thing about all this stuff is the relationship between glaciers and deep sea. This is, after all, a deep sea podcast. But the way in which that works is when the glaciers travel down the mountainside, they pick up stones and rocks and boulders, and then they slowly grind them into these big black angular blocks. So they look like almost like they've been like tombstone type of things, And then when it breaks off and ultimately flows out to sea, the iceberg melts. By the time the iceberg is seriously melting, you're probably pretty far offshore. And then these rocks just fall out of it. So it's called ice rafted debris, or IRDs. Some people call them drop stones, but we're seeing them all on those subdives. We're seeing them everywhere. And each and every one of them is completely populated by deep sea animals because you're delivering
a hard substrate.
Yeah. I mean, some of them are like big old boulders, like enormous big boulders, and they're you can tell they're IRDs because they're this really black, smooth, just angular things because they've just been eroded and grinded away down the mountainside all this time, and then suddenly they're floating out to sea in an ice cube, and then plop, and then they fall to 5,000 meters.
It's like a river stone in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, so there is, those physical connections between what's going on the continent and what's happening 5,000 meters nearby is pretty striking.
In general, when we're talking about the Antarctic benthos, we describe that the diversity and the biomass vary highly on small spatial scales. And a lot of that reason is because of the drop stones. So in one area, a lot of these bays were glaciated in the past and have retreated. And so we can do a dive, like a sub dive, in one bay, and it's just kind of flat and sand, soft sediment. And then you can move further out of the bay and find a patch of drop stones. And maybe it's only 100 meters away, but the biomass and the diversity varies significantly on that small scale. And that's because of the drop stones and that hard substrate that allows for the diversity and those animals to live on. So it absolutely is connected. So this glaciated region definitely is connected to everything that's happening in the deep sea.
Really tricky for habitat models because this isn't like, here is a rocky habitat, here is a sandy habitat. This is rocky habitat being airdropped into what would be sedimentary. So it's really hard to then quantify because, like you say, it's like super patchy, it's super localized. You can't generalize over hundreds of kilometers.
Yeah, and the other unique thing about Antarctica is obviously the temperatures is very, very low. So these trenches are the only places in the world which are super deep sea and sub-zero, and at certain depths become sub-zero. And the significance of that is we've probably spoken about this a few times on the podcast under various different contexts, but, high pressure, low temperature have the same perturbing effect on the cell. So if you want to go deep, you need to be warm. So places like Red Sea and stuff like that, if you're deep and cold, you'll tend to become shallower. And so for the idea is there's lots of deep sea species in Antarctica were actually much shallower than you find them other places, because that sub-zero condition is another perturbing effect in addition to the high pressure.
Yeah.
And so the guys worked it out in the 80s. I think it was something along the lines of a shift in 2 degrees Celsius is the same as a shift of 1,000 meters.
Oh, I hadn't heard it actually spelled out. That's cool.
Yeah. So if you look at somewhere like we were working before, like, I don't know, Mariana Trench is maybe 2-point-something degrees. At the same depth, there's over a 2 degree decrease in temperature here. So you'd expect a lot of deep sea stuff to be shallower. And to be honest, I think it's not as obvious from what we've seen so far, but there are signs of it. So there's enormous aggregations of rat tails, for example, are happening shallower than we'd normally see them. I mean, out in the Porcupine Abyssal Plain in the North Atlantic, it's normally about 4,800 meters. You see a lot of these things, but here it's between 3,800 meters to 4,000 meters is the real sweet spot for tons of these things. But over the next few weeks, hopefully we'll work shallower and see how far up some of these quintessentially deep sea species are going here. And it's almost certainly to do with temperature.
It's sometimes called deep sea emergence, and the cold water corals, or the deep water corals that we were talking about in the last episode, like the depth variation with these same species was huge. So that I was looking at them, say, around Ireland at 300 meters. But in the fjords of Norway, where it's much colder, you can scuba dive with them. They're at 40 meters. And we get the similar in the fjords here. We get sort of deep stuff coming a lot shallower.
It's the same in Alaska when I work up there. You can see species that normally we just see in the deep sea off the shelf, and we see them in the fjords in Alaska, like the red tree coral. Do you think that's why we're not seeing so many pycnogonids, Al?
I don't know. I was under the impression they were quite abundant around here, and because last time I was here, we had a time-lapse stills camera, and we put it at 2,000 meters, and there were 2 or 3 of them wandering around. And that was a time-lapse. I was taking a picture, I believe, every minute for about 10 hours, and we saw 2 or 3 just walking past the camera. So from that, I thought, well, there's obviously quite a lot of sea spiders going on. But then we deployed that first set of landers, and one of them was similar depth, and a sea spider did come along. It walked around the arm a little bit. You can see it on the latest YouTube video we put out. Just a little plug there. But I haven't seen one since. I caught sight of one in the sub. I don't think we recorded it, but just at the end of the dive, I was looking out, and I was like, "There's a sea spider," and we couldn't quite get the image of it. But I was under the impression there was loads, and I'm disappointed. I thought this place would be swarming with giant sea spiders, and I was going to fight them all.
And they get big, don't they? There's gigantism.
Yeah.
I'm disappointed as well, and quite surprised, because we do not see them on the peninsula in scuba depths. I know they are shallower in South Georgia and also in the Ross Sea around McMurdo. But on the peninsula, I've never, ever, even once in 10 years, seen one scuba diving. But in the subs, 200-300 meters, we see them regularly. Every day we see, multiple different species of pycnogonid. And so I was kind of under this impression that maybe they're just deeper than, any scuba depth. So 200-300 meters, yep, there's a sea spider. And so I really assumed we'd see more with the landers and your sub dives. And so I've just been really surprised by that.
Yeah, maybe we need to go shallower. I mean, the moment our shallowest one is just over 1,000 meters. We do have a potential 800 meter site on the list of things to do before we go, but everyone's a bit reluctant to go to 3 digits because it's just not our jam.
It's just not how you roll.
No, I know, but I think we're going to have to do it because we've been all over the deep bit, and we're just going to have to crawl back up. But it'll be worth it if we got some good sea spider pycnogonid stuff, because they're such a cool animal.
Yeah, that's why I think it's valuable information to have, because we don't actually know their depth range. I know it's not shallow, and I know, yes, it can be around 200 meters, but where does that line, where does it stop? When do they stop being so abundant,
That last one we saw was definitely the only one we recorded so far. I'm pretty sure that was 1,800 or 2,000. Can't remember now, but that's a good chunk away. But yeah, we should make that a priority for the next week. I want to get eyes on. I want to intense eye contact with a pycnogonid.
Enough fish.
Enough fish. I'm done with fish. So done with rat tails.
Grand. Well, I'll let you two go for your drinkies. It was really lovely to meet you, Shaylyn. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for the chat.
It's great to meet you.
All right. Cheers, Tom. Bye.
And that was a pressurized version of one of our longer episodes. If you enjoyed that and you would like to hear the full length episode, just match the episode numbers and you'll be able to find the full length version in the feed. Thanks for listening. We'll deep see you next time, and I abyss you already.